What if I told you some spirits never left their graves, and tonight they might be watching you? If you love ghost stories, hit subscribe, tap like, and share this video so we can bring you even more terrifying tales. Subscribe, like, share to keep the ghosts coming. The summer sun hung over the Mediterranean like a great molten coin, casting its blazing reflection upon the sea. Cyprus glimmered in the heat, its villages and resorts buzzing with the sound of tourists and the steady rhythm of cicadas. At Larnaca International Airport, the concrete runway shimmered, wavering as if half dissolved in a mirage. To any passerby, it was an ordinary August morning in 2005, the kind of day when flights came and went, delivering families to holidays, workers to their duties, lovers to reunions. But sometimes the ordinary holds within it a seed of the extraordinary, a seed that when it cracks open releases not wonder, but dread. That morning, Helios Airways Flight 522 prepared for departure, its silver fuselage gleaming like a blade under the merciless sky. It was bound for Athens, and then onward to Prague. The passengers were in light spirits, carrying bags, clutching passports, leaning against the glass of the departure lounge. None of them knew that their footsteps toward the jet bridge were the last they would ever take on solid earth. The Boeing 737-300 was a machine of reliability, a bird that had crossed countless skies. Its engines could roar with certainty. Its wings knew the invisible roads of the heavens. Yet beneath its skin there was a flaw waiting to awaken, an oversight, a small mechanical truth misread by human eyes. It is often so in tragedies. One unnoticed error, one uncorrected switch, one breath forgotten in the machinery of order. And when that error rises, it is not loud, but quiet. It does not scream like a siren, it whispers like a ghost. Inside the cockpit, Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten prepared his checklist, his mind sharp with routine. Beside him sat First Officer Pampos Charalambos, attentive, precise, the younger of the two but trained to handle the skies. Their conversation was clipped, professional, punctuated by the hum of instruments. Behind them, flight attendants greeted passengers, stowed bags, secured galleys. Among them was Andreas Bridromu, a man who would later be remembered as a solitary flicker of life inside a dying machine. The boarding process was ordinary. Children fidgeted. Parents calmed them with promises of sweets at the other end. Businessmen unfolded newspapers, couples whispered, tourists adjusted sunglasses. To every one of them, the aircraft was a vessel of convenience, not of doom. The jet bridge sealed, the door shut, and the world of the living was separated from the world they would never return to. Engines spooled, the ground trembled, and the 737 began its taxi. Its shadow stretched long across the tarmac, as if already hinting that the plane carried more darkness than light. At 9:07 a.m., Flight 522 lifted into the Aegean sky, a silver bird climbing toward its destiny. But destiny is not a straight line. It is a labyrinth, and inside this labyrinth, the passengers and crew had already taken a step too far to turn back. The ascent seemed ordinary. From the ground, the contrail was nothing but white chalk across the blue. Yet, within minutes, the oxygen inside the cabin began to thin. The pressurization system, left on manual instead of automatic, after maintenance checks, did not adjust to the rising altitude. The air grew frail, invisible, insufficient for lungs that had always trusted the machine. The alarms began. At first, a sound in the cockpit, one the captain believed to be an air conditioning problem. He and his first officer searched for explanations, their minds clouded by the subtle creep of hypoxia. Hypoxia, the thief of clarity, the slow erasure of thought, the dream that enters even before death. It does not feel like danger. It feels like sleep. The passengers felt it too. A strange drowsiness, a pressure in the head, a confusion about why masks had fallen from above. Flight attendants moved swiftly, securing masks over mouths, urging calm. But calm is fragile when the air itself is leaving. The emergency oxygen would last only minutes, a cruelly small reprieve. After that, there was nothing but the thin, merciless breath of the upper atmosphere. Imagine the cabin then. Dozens of passengers slumping, some still clutching masks, others already sliding into unconsciousness. The chatter of children silenced mid-sentence, the laughter of tourists replaced by stillness. Only the hum of engines remained, the sound of a machine that no longer carried life, but only but. The cabin was not yet a tomb, but it was no longer a sanctuary. It was something in between. a threshold between worlds. And that is where ghost stories always begin, at the threshold. From the ground, air traffic controllers called, their voices reaching into the void. There was no answer. They called again, their words like stones thrown into a well without echo. The plane did not turn, did not respond, did not falter. It continued steadily, faithfully, like a carriage pulled by invisible horses, toward a gate no one else could see. The Greek Air Force dispatched to F-16s, their sleek bodies cut through the air, their pilots alert, ready for an interception they assumed would end with protocol, not horror. As they approached, the 737 loomed ahead, steady, unyielding. They drew close, peered into the cabin. What they saw froze them. Rows of passengers slumped in their seats, masks dangling uselessly, their faces pale, their stillness absolute. The pilot's eyes scanned the cockpit. No movement, no gesture of recognition, no response to their signals. It was as if they were looking into a glass coffin, an airborne mausoleum. But then, impossibly, there was movement. A figure entered the cockpit, fumbling with controls, desperately trying to alter the aircraft's fate. It was Prodromou, the flight attendant, alive with the fire of survival. The F-16 pilots watched him struggle, watched his gestures, his fight against inevitability. For a moment, hope returned, but it was too late. The engine sputtered. Fuel had run its course. The aircraft, like a beast, denied its blood, faltered, dipped, and began its final descent. At 12:03 p.m. near Grammatico, the ghost flight ended in fire and ruin, metal torn against earth, souls released into silence. That is the story, as the world knows it, a mechanical oversight, a chain of human error, an accident recorded in black boxes and reports. But ghost stories are not satisfied with reports. They do not end when investigators close their files. They continue because the air remembers, the ground remembers, and the families who waited for loved ones who never arrived still carry the echo. Helios Airways Flight 522 became known as the ghost flight not simply because it flew without Pontius pilots, but because its presence lingered. The hills where it crashed are said to be uneasy, the winds there carrying whispers. Villagers speak of lights that move where no road exists, of voices like distant announcements echoing at night. Some claim to see the aircraft itself, a pale shape against the stars, still tracing its doomed arc. Perhaps this is only imagination. Perhaps it is the mind's need to transform unbearable tragedy into haunting myth. But perhaps, just perhaps, what flies once in this world does not land only here. Perhaps in another sky, another layer of reality. Helios 522 still drifts, its passengers forever asleep, its engines silent, its shadow endless. The ghost flight belongs now, not only to aviation history, but to the lore of haunted journeys, like the Flying Dutchman doomed to sail forever, like phantom trains that thunder through forgotten tunnels. Flight 522 has taken its place in the library of the uncanny, and as with all such tales, its introduction is only the beginning. Because once a door opens to the supernatural, it never closes again. The crash site at Grammatico smoldered for days, the blackened earth holding on to the screams it had never heard. Firefighters picked through the wreckage, their faces grim, their eyes haunted by the sight of belongings scattered among twisted metal children's toys, shoes with their laces undone. Watchers stopped at the moment of impact, but long after the smoke cleared, there were whispers that the ground itself remained restless, that the mountain had not swallowed the tragedy, but carried it like a wound. Villagers spoke of nights when a low hum passed overhead, though no aircraft was scheduled to fly, a vibration like the breathing of a giant. Shepherds tending their flocks swore they heard voices drifting from the hills, faint but insistent, like announcements over an intercom echoing through the sky. Investigators worked with clinical precision, combing through black boxes, reconstructing events, marking technical failures. They spoke of manual pressurization settings, of alarms misinterpreted, of human confusion. But the people who lived near Grammatico did not speak in such terms. They told each other of lights appearing at odd hours, of figures seen on the ridges, silhouettes against the moon that vanished when approached. They told of the air growing inexplicably thin, as if the mountain itself remembered the suffocation of that final flight. At first, the stories stayed local, dismissed as grief-made illusions, but soon they began to spread. Travelers passing through the area reported unease, Drivers on the highway that wound past the crash site said they saw shapes on the road at night, families crossing, their faces pale, their movements slow. When headlights touched them, the figures dissolved into smoke, leaving only the smell of burnt kerosene. Pilots approaching Athens began to murmur of strange anomalies, of radar blips that appeared and vanished, of faint transmissions carried on radio frequencies, half sentences in Greek and English, distorted, fragmented, like conversations trapped between life and death. It was said that a woman's voice sometimes came through most clearly, repeating a single question: "Are we landing soon?" No one ever answered. Supernaturalists, drawn by the tragedy, began to arrive. Some came with cameras and recorders, hoping to capture evidence of the restless dead. Others came with prayers, candles, and rituals, believing the souls had not found peace. One group swore they saw the aircraft itself, whole and intact, descending through the night sky before dissolving into starlight above the crash site. Another group heard the sound of oxygen masks dropping, the soft metallic thud of plastic against seatback, though they stood in an open field beneath no ceiling but the heavens. At night, when the wind carried the scent of pine and smoke, some claimed to see passengers walking in silence along the hillsides, moving not with the frantic confusion of the doomed, but with the weary patience of those trapped in a dream. Their mouths moved, but their voices did not carry, as though they spoke only in the pressurized silence of another world. The lore deepened. Families of the lost came to lay flowers, and some reported feeling hands brush, as though no one was near. A mother claimed she heard her child's laughter in the rustle of branches. A man said he felt his wife sit beside him on a rock, her weight depressed the stone, her perfume linger in the wind. Though when he turned, the space was empty. The line between grief and haunting blurred until no one could separate one from the other. The mountain became both grave and shrine, both memorial and threshold. In time, spiritualists began to speak of Flight 522, not merely as a tragedy, but as a vessel trapped between realms. They said the passengers, lulled into eternal unconsciousness, did not realize they had died. They believed the plane continued to exist, replaying its final flight in a liminal sky, a corridor of eternity where engines hummed but no one breathed, where announcements echoed but no one listened. Pilots whispered of encountering it, a pale 737 gliding silently alongside them for a few minutes before vanishing into cloud. Some said its windows glowed faintly, as if lit from within by a cold fire. Others swore they saw faces pressed to the glass, watching the living with longing or accusation. Air traffic controllers reported ghost calcines, a transponder that flickered into existence before disappearing. The code always matched the number, 522. And then there were the dreams. Families of the victims shared uncanny visions of being on a plane that never landed, of walking through a cabin where masks dangled, where passengers sat motionless, where a single attendant tried endlessly to rouse them. They awoke, drenched in sweat, their ears ringing as if from altitude, their lungs aching as if from thin air. When they compared stories, they found too many details alike to dismiss. Mediums described the souls as being trapped in a loop, reliving the confusion of that day. They spoke of the need for release, for acknowledgement, for prayers, strong enough to cut through the fog. Yet each attempt rituals under the moon, ceremonies at the site seemed to stir the haunting further. After one such rite, a local priest swore he heard the roar of engines overhead, though the sky was clear. He looked up and saw a shadow pass across the moon, shaped unmistakably like a plain dot. The haunting was no longer confined to the crash site. Strange happenings spread to Athens International Airport, where Flight 522 had been scheduled to land. Ground staff reported phantom announcements in the early morning, a boarding call for a flight long cancelled. Travelers waiting in terminals swore they heard footsteps pacing behind them, only to find no one there. Some claimed to see a 737 parked on a distant stand, lit as though ready for departure, but when they approached, the space was empty. The story of the ghost flight became inseparable from the tragedy itself. Newspapers still wrote of technical failures and systemic errors, but beneath those explanations, another narrative was taking root, a narrative of spirits in transit, of a plane that never arrived, of a journey unfinished. And so the haunting deepened, not with screams but with silence, not with terror but with unease. The dead did not rage, they waited, they drifted in the sky, they lingered in the hills, they pressed their presence upon anyone who dared to look too closely. In the dark hours before dawn, when the air grew still and the stars hung like frozen eyes above the Aegean, it was said you could hear them breathing, faintly, as though still trying to draw oxygen from a cabin that would never again be whole. The ghost flight had become more than memory. It had become an echo that refused to fade. It had become a question that no answer could resolve. It had become a story that, once entered, no one could leave unchanged, and all who whispered of it knew that the haunting had only just begun.
The nights over Attica grew heavier, as though the sky itself carried weight. Those who lived near Grammatico began to notice Patton's strange winds that stirred only at certain hours, the way animals fell silent, the uneasy flicker of lights in homes perched upon the ridges. It was said that the mountain did not forget, that the soil carried voices that the air could not, and when the moon waxed full, a pale glow would hang above the slopes, shaped like wings stretched in descent. It began with whispers in dreams. Pilots who had never flown Helios Airways awoke gasping, their ears filled with static, their hands reaching for controls they had never touched. Passengers long accustomed to flight found themselves dreaming of oxygen masks, of corridors lined with rows of unmoving bodies, of the steady hum of engines in darkness. They would wake in their homes, safe, yet trembling with the memory of having been thousands of feet above the earth in a cabin not their own. Dreams became visitations. A stewardess in Thessaloniki swore she saw a colleague in her spa, man she recognized from photographs of the doomed crew, beckoning her down an endless aisle, pointing toward a door at the back of the aircraft. But when she reached for the handle, she awoke, heart hammering, the sound of depressurization hissing in her ears. The haunting was no longer confined to place. It had begun to spread through people, a contagion of memory belonging to none of them. Families of the lost gathered and spoke in low tones, realizing they had shared the same dream, each detail precise, as though they had been passengers together on a flight that still flew somewhere beyond time. Mediums claimed the souls were locked in a loop, that their unconsciousness had become eternal, and that each night the plane rose again, tracing the same arc of doom, seeking a landing that never came. The Air Force pilots who had intercepted the ghost remembered the sight forever. Rows of bodies slumped in silence, a single man struggling at the controls. They told their story reluctantly, but at night, when sleep should have brought rest, they heard the engines return. In their dreams, they were always flying alongside it, always watching, always unable to intervene. One pilot swore he saw faces pressed against the windows, dozens of them, pale and indistinct, but staring with a hunger so profound it could not belong to the living. Spiritualists began to call the aircraft a liminal vessel, a machine caught between worlds. Some said it was no longer a 737, but a chariot of the dead, forever bridging earth and sky. They believed the crash had not ended the journey, only fractured it. The passengers, they said, had never understood their own deaths. Their bodies perished, but their souls remained seated, waiting for descent, waiting for the doors to open. The plane became their purgatory, a capsule of endless expectation, and the signs grew darker. Travelers through Athens International Airport at night began to report phantom boarding announcements, always for a flight to Prague, always gate numbers that no longer existed. One man followed the voice across empty corridors until he reached a gate sealed with glass. Beyond it, he swore, he saw the faint shimmer of a jet bridge extending into nothingness. The sound of boarding passes tearing filled the air, yet the space was empty. When he returned, hours had passed. Though his watch marked only minutes, ground crews whispered of baggage carts moving on their own, of suitcases appearing on belts without tags, tagged only with the number 522 scrawled in faded ink. One cart held a child's stuffed toy, scorched at the edges, though no such item was logged in lost and found. Workers who touched it reported hearing laughter in their ears, followed by silence so total it pressed like weight upon their chests. In Grammatico, the haunting reached its crescendo. Entire nights were consumed by the sound of engines rolling overhead. The radar showed empty skies. Shepherds abandoned certain pastures, claiming their flocks grew mad, rushing blindly as if chased by invisible predators. Hikers who strayed too close to the crash site spoke of corridors unfolding before their, miles lined with empty seats, armrests cold beneath their hands, masks dangling like pendulums. Some emerged babbling, insisting they had walked through the wreckage only to find it whole, suspended in a twilight cabin where time did not move. And then came the apparitions, Families of the dead began to see their loved ones at the edges of fields, at the corners of rooms, in reflections of glass, not screaming, not decayed, but waiting, always waiting. A mother swore she awoke one night to find her daughter sitting at the foot of her bed, still in holiday clothes, her lips moving as though asking a question, but no sound came. When the mother reached forward, the figure dissolved into mist that smelled of jet fuel and scorched cloth. The climax of haunting unfolded when an entire village near the mountain reported a blackout. The lights died, and with them came a roar above. Villagers poured into the streets, staring at the night sky. There, descending low, was a shape of impossible size, a plane gliding silently, its windows glowing with cold fire. Through the glass, they swore they saw faces pressed, dozens, hundreds, watching with blank eyes. The aircraft flew not with the grace of a machine, but with the inevitability of a specter. As it passed over the rooftops, the villagers dropped to their knees, some praying, some weeping, some unable to move at all. The shape dissolved into smoke as it reached the hills, and with its vanishing, the lights of the village returned. Those who witnessed it never forgot. Some claimed they heard voices afterward, calling names that belonged to no one alive. Others said they carried the weight of suffocation in their lungs for weeks. One man swore his dreams no longer belonged to him, that he now lived each night inside the endless loop of a flight where no one awoke. The haunting was no longer subtle, it had become a tide, a force pressing through cracks in the world. The ghost flight was not a memory, it was an ongoing event, repeating across realms, dragging all who touched its story into its orbit. Reality bent beneath its weight, as though the crash had torn a hole between worlds and the wound had never healed. The passengers still sat in their seats, the cabin still hummed, the masks still swayed, and all who felt its presence knew that the story was not one of closure, but of endless continuation. The climax was not an end, but a widening, a revelation that what dies does not always stay buried. Some flights do not land, and some journeys never finish. The sky itself had become haunted, and every contrail crossing above Greece seemed to carry with it the whisper of Flight 522, the murmur of souls still waiting to arrive.
The engines whined, not with the strength of mechanical thrust, but with a hollow resonance that echoed like distant thunder inside a cathedral. It was no longer the sound of a plane in flight, it was the sound of a tomb in the sky. The passengers sat motionless, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their lips frozen in silent prayers or gasps that would never be finished. But behind their stillness, something else moved. The atmosphere was shifting, as though the very air inside the fuselage remembered their final breaths and played them back endlessly. Whispers emerged where no mouths opened, and the temperature shifted between biting cold and suffocating heat. A passenger in the second row, whose face had long since been drained of blood, seemed to tilt his head just slightly, as though acknowledging the living who now trespassed into his eternal space. His eyes, though glassy and hollow, seemed to glisten with recognition, impossible recognition, directed at those who still walked the earth. And in that moment, it became clear, the dead were not bound by silence. They carried their last words within the echoes of the fuselage, replaying them until time itself bent. A flight attendant's shadow moved near the aisle, her form faint, as if projected onto smoke. She smoothed invisible hair, adjusted her jacket, and turned with a professional smile that no longer belonged to the living. In her hands was not a tray, but a folded scrap of paper, on which a single word burned and reformed in an endless loop. Return. Each time her form flickered, the word smudged into something different. Remember, then repent, then remain. The living could not decide which command was true, for all of them seemed to apply, and so the passengers, both seen and unseen, were bound in a paradox. The desire to return to the earth, the need to be remembered, the fear of repentance, and the curse of remaining suspended in the limbo of sky. The windows grew darker, as though the sun had abandoned the flight entirely. Through the glass, there was no sky, no clouds, no earth, only a blackness that pulsed faintly, like the inside of a colossal heart. And from within that darkness, faces began to emerge, distorted, fluid, merging one into another like ripples on water. They pressed against the glass, screaming without sound, their mouths stretched wide, as if begging to be let in or to be let out. The plane was no longer a machine of steel and wires. It was a vessel, a sarcophagus carried not by air but by grief, carrying the essence of every soul that had ever been lost mid-flight. This was not just Helios 522, was every ghost flight, every tragedy, every wandering spirit that had been suspended between worlds. And tonight, the weight of all those souls converged here. The living who dared to tell this story. Pilots, investigators, journalists would later describe sensations that made no rational sense. The smell of kerosene when no fuel was present, the metallic taste of blood at the back of their throats, the sudden ringing of ears, like altitude sickness in a sealed office, the vision of frost forming on windows when the room itself was warm, and most chilling of all, the sound of a flight attendant's intercom click, followed by a single fragment of speech. Ladies and gentlemen, before dissolving into static, these experiences were not confined to Greece, nor Cyprus, nor the wreckage site. They traveled like echoes through time, attaching themselves to those who dared to remember. The flight's energy had not dispersed. It had multiplied, becoming a spectral contagion carried by memory itself. That as the story deepened, another detail emerged. The boy, witness as if they could be called, that spoke of a boy who appeared at the edge of dreams, sometimes at the corner of waking vision. He wore no expression, only wide, searching eyes. His hands were clenched into small fists, as though holding onto something invisible. He would ask, in a voice too soft for the living to fully hear, "Where are we going?" And no answer ever came. For some, this boy would appear sitting in the last row of a bus, staring at the back of the driver's head. For others, he would be seen in the reflection of an airplane window mid-flight. Though no child was seated nearby, his presence was tied to Helios 522, but his reach extended far beyond. A restless passenger looking for an arrival that never came. Perhaps he was real, perhaps he was the embodiment of every child who had died in the sky, condensed into a single, unanswerable question. Either way, his voice became a refrain, an echo passed between dreamers. Where are we going? The climax of this haunting lay not in the tragedy itself, but in the way time seemed to fold around it. Survivors of other disasters reported sensing Helios 522 among their own experiences, as if the plane itself had entered the archetype of death. During moments of turbulence, some claimed to see, just beyond the wing, another aircraft flying in peril, translucent, its windows lit by a cold blue glow. It would vanish after seconds, leaving behind only the smell of ozone. Pilots whispered that it was the ghost of 522, eternally circling the skies, seeking a landing strip that no longer existed. Air traffic controllers swore they received faint, staticky signals on old frequencies, call signs half-formed, voices that identified themselves with numbers long retired. Some dared to answer, only to be met with silence. Others refused, terrified that acknowledging the transmission might tether them to its endless loop. The crescendo of the haunting came when the line between earth and sky, life and death, seemed to dissolve. Dreamers awoke midnight with the sensation of descending, oxygen masks dropping before their eyes, only to realize they were still in their own rooms. Parents heard the muffled cries of children asking for water, only to find their sons and daughters asleep, lips unmoving. A woman in Cyprus claimed she woke with frost covering her bedsheets, her breath visible, as though she had been transported to the freezing cabin of Helios 522 for a fragment of eternity. And in Greece, near the crash site, shepherds swore that on certain nights the wind carried voices in English and Greek, overlapping, repeating instructions no one could obey. Brace, brace, oxygen masks on, as if the training of the living had become the eternal loop of the dead. But the end did not come with a scream. It came with silence, a silence so profound that it swallowed memory, swallowed explanation, swallowed even the possibility of closure. The wreckage was cleared, the victims buried, the investigations concluded, yet the silence lingered, as if mocking the idea of resolution. For silence is not an absence, it is a presence in disguise. It is the weight of every word that cannot be spoken, every answer that will never arrive. And so Helios 522 did not indict, simply shifted into another form, another dimension, where its story would be replayed by every witness, every dreamer, every listener. The silence became the haunting, and within that silence, if one listens long enough, the faintest sound emerges, a boy's voice, whispering, "Where are we going?" The night did not settle quietly over the hills of Grammaticos. It pressed down, heavy and deliberate, carrying the weight of something unseen. For those who lived near the crash site, silence was never truly silence. They spoke of faint echoes carried on the wind, fragments of language from another place, another moment, a metallic groan that sounded like an aircraft under strain, a sudden rush of air, like a cabin decompressing, a cough, a child's laugh, then nothing, always nothing, as if the night itself had slammed a door shut before the voices could spill through completely. But the people knew better. They had come to accept that what ended on August 14, 2005, had not truly ended. It had transformed into something else, something that hovered between memory and reality, ready to surface whenever the living forgot their vigilance. Travelers who passed near the crash site began to feel strange sensations. Car engines stalled without cause, phones drained of power, even when freshly charged. GPS systems rerouted themselves in loops, leading drivers back to the same desolate stretch of road overlooking the hills. Some spoke of glimpsing lights in the sky, silent lights moving with the deliberate grace of an aircraft, but without wings or sound. For those brave or foolish enough to watch longer than a few seconds, the vision would dissolve into a plume of smoke, followed by the faint impression of dozens of faces pressed against invisible windows, watching them back. The faces never lingered, but the sensation of being observed clung to the witnesses for weeks, sometimes years. The feeling that someone unseen had found them, marked them, remembered them. Time, too, became unstable for those who listened too closely to the tale of Helios 522. A man in Athens claimed he boarded a routine flight in 2012, only to look around mid-journey and find the cabin filled with people in early 2000s clothing, denim jackets, flip phones, hairstyles that had gone out of fashion years earlier. None of the passengers acknowledged him. They stared blankly forward, oxygen masks dangling uselessly above their heads. He blinked once, and the vision dissolved. But the smell lingered, a sharp tang of ozone and stale air that followed him even as he disembarked. Others claimed to have dreams that were not their own, sitting in a cold seat, the plastic mask biting into their cheeks, the pressure in their ears unbearable, the captain silent. They would wake, gasping, drenched in sweat, yet certain they had been somewhere else, reliving something they should never have known. There were patterns, though few wanted to admit it. The number 522 appeared in strange places, hotel rooms assigned at random, receipts totaling $5.22, radio frequencies bleeding static at precisely 5:22 a.m. Pilots reported their altimeters freezing for brief moments at exactly 5,220 feet before resuming normal function. These coincidences were dismissed as chance, but those attuned to the whispers of the supernatural knew better. They knew that the dead often carved pathways back into the world of the living through numbers, symbols, repetition. They knew that the flight still flew, somewhere, somewhen, and that its passengers reached out in the only ways they could, not to terrify, but to remind the living that forgetting is the true death, that silence is not peace but exile. One investigator, long after retirement, confessed in a private letter that he had seen something during the recovery of the wreckage. He wrote of walking through the field of debris when he felt a sudden drop in temperature. His breath crystallized before him. Though it was August and the sun burned overhead, he turned, and in the shimmer of heat rising from the wreckage, he saw the entire fuselage intact. The plane stood upright on the field, immaculate, every window glowing faintly from within. He swore he saw silhouettes moving behind the glass, calm and orderly, as though waiting for For a moment he believed rescue had been a success, that somehow he was looking at a parallel version of events where no one had died. But then the vision flickered, the heat shimmer collapsed, and the wreckage returned, broken and silent. He never spoke of it aloud, but the letter was found after his death. The paper smelled faintly of smoke. The legends deepened when travelers in other parts of the world began to report encounters. A woman on a flight from London to Rome awoke to find her seatbelt buckled by unseen hands. She looked around, but no one had touched her. On a train crossing Germany, a man heard an intercom announcement in English, instructing passengers to fasten oxygen masks, though the train had no such system. A fisherman in Cyprus swore he saw, above the water, the shadow of a plane moving silently across the sea, though no engines roared overhead. When he looked closer, the reflection on the water did not match any known aircraft. It was blurred, ghostly, yet unmistakably real. These fragments stitched themselves together into a story larger than Greece, larger than Cyprus, larger than the Mediterranean. Helios 522 had become more than a tragedy. It had become an echo chamber of souls, expanding outward, seeking those who would listen. And then there was the boy, always the boy. His face appeared in mirrors, his voice in dreams, his question unchanging. Where are we going? Those who answered, whether aloud or in thought, found their lives unsettled afterward. One teacher, who whispered, "Home," during a dream of the boy, lost her way driving through her own neighborhood the next day, as if the roads themselves had rearranged. A pilot, who muttered, "Nowhere," in response, reported that every compass he touched for months spun endlessly, never settling on true north. And one man, who dared to say, "You were already there," claimed his house was filled with the sound of distant engines every night at 5:22, lasting exactly 14 minutes, the length of Helios 522's final unpiloted descent. These were not hallucinations. They were interactions, dialogues with a presence that refused to accept death's finality. The story does not end because it cannot. Wreckage may be cleared, graves may be filled, investigations may close, but the essence of what happened continues to circle. Like the plane itself, which never truly landed, the souls of its passengers remain airborne, caught between dimensions. And perhaps that is the true horror. Not the flames, not the silence, not the tragedy of oxygen masks hanging unused. The true horror is suspension, the endless flight, the endless waiting, the endless question unanswered. Where are we going? It is not only their question, it is ours. Every time we board a plane, every time we entrust ourselves to the skies, we borrow courage from the unseen, and we risk becoming part of the eternal fleet of ghost flights that roam above the clouds. So when you look out your window, high above the earth, and see another plane flying parallel, ask yourself, is it flesh and steel, or shadow and memory? When your screen displays static at 5:22, or your dream carries you into a cold cabin with silent passengers, ask yourself, are you the observer or the observed? And when the silence thickens, pressing against your ears like altitude itself, listen closely, for beneath the silence you may hear it, the faint, unending whisper of a boy who never reached his destination, asking once more, where are we going?